favorite Taylor Swift album. I decided that for my first video, I wanted to make every single Evermore outfit from the Eras tour because that just sounds like a really good idea. Alright, so the first thing I decided to make was the Evermore cloak, which wasn't actually that hard. I just took my mock-up material, cut it into some triangles, sewed it all together, which I did actually think this was going to be, the whole thing was going to be the size, but it ended up being a bit small, so I just used this as half of it. I then took it all apart and used these pieces for my pattern pieces. Now, in this, I put the front piece of the cloak the wrong way on the velvet, which then made it so then that front bit was like darker than the rest. Now, this is my first time ever sewing velvet, which is actually a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I think this took me like 5 tries just to get this one seam, and I only struggled with the first seam, and I think that was because my velvet was facing 2 different directions. I ended up having to get my mum to help me. There she is. And we pinned and clipped this whole thing together just because the 2 layers kept shifting on each other and they just would not go together. Yeah. You go like, oh. It's so heavy. It is. I really like it so far, and I just have to get a clasp, a closure. Dress 1. I laid all of my fabric on the ground and I had to measure all the way along. I can't actually remember how long I made it, but I made 2 separate rectangles because it's a 2-tiered skirt, and I just ended up making my ruffles out of another piece of the skirt as well. So here's me doing all the ruffles. This is what I've got so far. It's looking like this. What I've done, because it's got a ruffle on the dress, so I kind of just like made a really long bit and then folded it down and then folded it over. So it's like, you can kind of tell there. This one was actually like the easiest dress to make, which is really good. And then I started draping the bodice on the dress form, which this is actually the first time I had ever done this, which for my first time was actually really good. But this dress form doesn't actually fit me well at all, so I had to make quite a few adjustments to it. It's fitting, kind of. I'm definitely gonna have to add more in the back because there is like, this is what I have done so far. The shoulder seam isn't lining up on the dress form, but I have lined the bottom half. I haven't lined the cup parts yet, but I will do that eventually. I'll have to undo the top part of the bodice first before I attach the cups together. But it's all lined. And now for making the foam things, I don't actually remember what they're called, but I had to make them because all of the ones that I had didn't fit. So I just took a bunch of old ones, cut them all up, and then sewed them together. I used my pattern for the top. I used that to make the cup parts, which actually turned out really well. And then I just hand like basted them onto the material just so it was going to be easier to sew them together once I'd attached the whole dress together. And I actually had to unpick the whole top part of my bodice just because I forgot that I would have to put the cup parts in between the 2 layers, so I just sandwiched them in there, and then you have to try and stitch them on the curve, which is a little bit hard. I have sewn them together. Woo! I attached the bodice and the skirt together, and then I pinned up the back, sewed it all down the side except for the top, leaving like a little bit at the top for my zip. I'm doing the bottom ruffle. The only part I have to put on still is this part here. Then after that, all I have to do is cut there. And I already put the zipper in as well. Righty, here's the dress. I am about to cut the slit into it. Originally, I left this like gap in the ruffle because I was just gonna cut the slit up there, but it's a bit too close to the middle. I've got this little cut here, which is not that far, but I now have to slice it from here all the way up to that green pin there. So I put the dress on first, pinned it where I wanted it to hit, and then took it off and cut it down that part. Now for the second Evermore dress, which is like the yellow one, I started by, this is actually a new dress form I made. I wrapped myself in Glad wrap and then sticky taped the whole thing and stuffed it. So it's like pretty much to my size. It is a little bit too big for me, but this actually helped quite a bit to get a proper size, because the first dress I had to make quite a few adjustments. So I made the pattern on that. I just draped it all on there and then took it all off, drew it all up into pattern pieces. I ended up re-cutting out pieces to do another mock-up. My mum then helped me to decide on dyes. We did 3 test dyes for this: 80% yellow, 20% orange, a 50% yellow, 40% orange, 10% brown, and a 80% orange and 20% brown, which actually was my favorite color. We ended up going with an 85% yellow, 10% orange, and 5% brown. All right, so I have done the mock-up, which it actually fits really well. This here is the final result. It's quite yellow, which is alright. It's really wrinkly as well. I have to iron it. I then pinned down all of my pattern pieces to my fabric, cut it all out, making sure everything was in the right direction. I did do 2 of these just because I wanted to add boning into it, so I needed 2 layers for the lining. When I was ironing out my Georgette, I actually burnt it with the iron, so I had to make sure I went around that. I then basted one lining layer and my outer layer together after overlocking them. I then attached the cut pieces to the bodice, and then after sewing all my lining layers together as well, I pinned my lining layer and my outer layer good side to good side, and then sewed all around the top of this. After sewing, I sliced up all of my seam allowance just so that when I turn it inside out, it'll lay nice and flat. I then used zip ties to make my boning. Here I am using underwire, but I ended up taking that out just because it wasn't sitting how I wanted it to sit, and also when I was sewing my boning channels, I left the underwire in and I got my needle stuck in it and it snapped off and got stuck in the underwire and I couldn't get it out. I sewed all of my boning channels and made sure the zip ties actually fit in it. This is my first time doing boning as well, so not all of my seams are straight, but I did try my best. I then did some basting stitches on the top of my skirt just so I can get it all ruffly, and I also did that to my lining layer. I then also did another basting stitch to hold these 2 layers together, and then pinned my bodice to my skirt and sewed them together. Now to make the ruffles, I ended up using an overcasting foot to almost do like a rolled hem on the edge. I then used my overlocker on a tighter tension to make these pieces ruffled. After attaching all of my ruffles together, I pinned my bottom ruffle to the bottom of this dress. These are my ruffles. They're a lot more ruffly, like they're a lot bigger than Taylor's. Hers kind of stick up, and I think they're a lot shorter, but I honestly don't mind them like that. And this is just here to visualize what a bow there is going to look like. I then cut my rayon layer to a bit shorter than my top layer, so then you can see the rayon underneath. I then hand stitched all of the applique onto the front of the dress. I didn't end up putting any on the skirt just because it was already a bit busy. It's a shorter version of the dress. And then the last thing I did was attach the zipper and stitch up the bottom of the skirt.